Guten Morgen zurück. Am dritten Tag unseres Symposiums freue mich, dass doch noch einige da sind und natürlich alle gespannt sind jetzt auf die Keynote. Wir beginnen also den Tag heute mit einem weiteren Blick von außen, was ja immer ganz hilfreich ist, dass wir nicht immer nur auf uns selbst schauen. Und Professorin Baibre wird es ausgesprochen, ich habe sie gefragt, Baibre Redmond aus Dublin wird ihn uns geben. She is a Professor of Higher Education and Provost of Universität 21. And therefore she gives us a very international view, because this network, Universität 21, is a worldwide network, I learned, of 27 research-intensive universities. And Baibre wants that we, and that is a lot, reimagine student learning in a time of global change. And we are very interested now in listening to you, and after that there is a discussion. Und erneut, es ist möglich, Fragen auf Deutsch zu stellen. Wir haben eine Native Speakerin unter uns, die dann auch übersetzt. Falls Sie sagen, ich möchte lieber auf Deutsch später diskutieren, ist überhaupt kein Problem. Thank you, Baibre.
Good morning, everybody. I was introduced, my name is Baibre Redmond. I'm a proud European as an Irish woman. And at a time of great uncertainty in my country. I come to you, my entire academic career has been spent at Universität College Dublin, where I am still Professor of Higher Education, but I also was a Vice President academic, and so very involved in the whole development of teaching and learning, and good teaching and learning in a research-intensive university. And there's a very good book by a woman called Carolyn Kreber, who talks about universities and their tribes, the different tribes we belong to in universities. And I do come to you here this morning as somebody who is in the teaching tribe, and somebody who is very wedded to teaching. 2 years ago, I was seconded full-time, 100% of my time, to Universität 21. Universität 21 is a 27-member university network. All of the universities are research-intensive universities. This is a network where every member pays a subscription to join, and we work together, in my role as provost now, in delivering joint programs, opportunities, events, and research opportunities and teaching opportunities for our nearly 1.3 million students in the 27 universities, and over 250,000 academics and staff. These are our members. We go all around the world. We don't have a German member at the moment, but we are always open to negotiations, so put that out there. The important thing about our university, the Universität 21, is its interest in research and its focus on research. And when I worked full-time in Universität College Dublin, I found Universität 21 an extremely valuable resource for me in helping me support good teaching at the university. And one of the unique features of Universität 21 is its interest in good education in research-intensive universities. And as you'll see there, most of our members are in the world top 200, and 65% of them are in the world top 100. Our top university is the National University of Singapore, which at the moment is number 12 in the world. We deliver our projects in U21 through a number of different areas. We have student experience, which has a lot to do with student mobility, researcher engagement, but this is the area I'm going to be talking to you about mostly today, and that's educational innovation. And I'm going to share with you the pressures that I am seeing across the world in universities. And I suppose what I'm saying to you this morning is, if what I'm talking about doesn't seem familiar to you, My guess is it will be familiar to you in the next 5 to 10 years. And as borders become more permeable and as change becomes more global, I don't think any country can escape the kind of global changes that are coming towards us in higher education. The 4 big trends that I'm seeing internationally at the moment, the first is changing demographics, and I'll take you through some figures quite quickly on that. The next is national internationalization strategies, how different countries are seeking international students and how students are beginning to move across the world and not complete all their education within their own country. The impact of educational technology, seen 5 or 6 years ago as something that was going to transform all our lives. And I think I just want to talk to you about the warnings of some of the expectations we had about educational technology and some of the realities about how it can be of benefit for us. And the last point I want to talk to you about is the 4th Industrial Revolution. And this is the term I am hearing more and more as I travel across the world. Not really the technological changes that come from it, but the impact on our students and how our students have to be taught to prepare for it. And I do understand, and all my work that I'm talking about today is based on your interest in knowledge transfer. My own academic work for years has been on the development of reflection and critical thinking, which is really at the foundation of how you allow students to transfer knowledge. It's how they can have multiple perspectives, it's how they can have cognitive flexibility, and how we teach for that critical thought and that mature intelligence that needs to come for students to be able to transfer knowledge into different areas. And I'll finish off with some examples of good practice across the U21 network. First, I want to talk to you about demographics and the great, I know I was talking to the Vice President Academic from the University of Bremen, and we were talking about the huge issues of different regulations, but the word massification of higher education is one that you hear so much at the moment. Just want to mention that. As you know, the world is growing exponentially. By 1950, I'm sorry, I was getting a little bit excited with my finger there. That in 1950, Germany was 6th largest country in the world. By the time we get to the end of this century, you have particularly the power of China and then India, which will be the largest country in the world, but also the growth of sub-Saharan Africa. And again, this has a very major impact on the kind of student populations we're going to be seeing in the next 10 or 20 years. Changes in world cohorts. We have a growing older population and a diminishing younger population. This, of course, has a major impact on what countries are asked to do. And this is an interesting figure because it's this is the projection that by 2020 there will be more Germans over 60 than under 30. Now, this has an impact on higher education because it's how your country and many countries deal with the added pressure that brings. It's the pressure on pensions, on healthcare, how we deal with an aging population, and how much any country is willing to invest in this smaller under 30 cohort, who we have, certainly in my generation, we have grown up to expect to be our students. Global enrollment in higher education is growing. It has probably peaked in terms of national cohorts in Western Europe and in America. It's starting to peak in Eastern Europe, and I'll show you where the growth is happening at this stage. Where are the highest student numbers? Up to 2,000, Western Europe and America had the greatest number of students in higher education. In 2003, the Eastern Asia and Pacific region overtook us with the highest number of students. And now we're beginning to see the power of China, of Indonesia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan coming into the higher education system. In 2014, South and Western Asia began to overtook Europe and America again, and that's the emergence of India as a very strong higher education power. Looking at the figures, Europe's higher education survival will increasingly depend on international students, simply because we won't have the same number of our own students to fund our universities and to go into higher levels, postgraduate levels, and postdoctoral and doctoral and postdoctoral levels. And we are all to rely very strongly on international students. Post the 2008 crash, Ireland, who was very affected by the crash, only survived by taking in very great numbers of international students, with a really considerable impact on the size of students in our classrooms, on the way we were able to teach, and on the quality of our teaching. But it allowed us to survive. I would say that Irish higher education in the last 5 years has been managed by probably two of the worst strategies, which is underfunding and over-management and micromanagement, which together is probably, that combination of that is deadly to higher education. And the rankings of the Irish universities have been dropping as a response to that. To remind you of when, a long time ago, when I was an undergraduate, the notion of elite universities. The elite system, where only 15% of the population went to university. Moving to massification, which is anything from 15 to 100%, 50% of your population, to universal higher education, where over 50% to 100% of the school leavers in a population go to university. The University of Korea, South Korea in Seoul, is one of the members of Universität 21, and 96% of Korean school leavers go to university. That's a fully universalized higher education system. The difference between the systems we'll go through quite fast. The elite system has a lot to do with the access as privilege of birth and talent, and also seen as shaping the minds and characters of the ruling classes. You will still see this in some of the very high prestige universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale. Again, you will see a great sense of privilege in attending these private universities. The massified system sees that it's a right not for all but for some, and that it's connected to the transmission of skills and the preparation of the population for technical and economic leadership roles. So this 50% are seeing as the next cohort that will lead the society. A universal system sees higher education as an expectation for most of our school leavers, and this is what we're seeing in Western Europe. And that really prepares the entire population, or most of the majority of the population, to survive social and technological change. This is a hard graph to read. The numbers are actually the numbers on the horizontal axis are numbers of countries in these areas. So in sub-Saharan Africa, there are 41 countries. But this is where we are in terms of elite, massified and universal systems. As you'll see, North American and Western Europe, we're almost entirely a universal system, that 50% or over of our school leavers go to university, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa it's still highly elite. But Central and Eastern Europe are getting there as well, and growing numbers of of countries have now universal higher education systems. What this means is an elite system, and when I worked for many years with academics, older academics who remembered the academic freedom of the elite system that they had grown up with, the power that they had to make decisions in what they taught, in what students they took in, was very influenced when we moved initially to a massified system where there was a growing power in university management. And I think that that was one of the greatest social shocks as universities, particularly when we went into the Bologna process and the Copenhagen Accord, when we started to look at quality assurance. It was a very great shock, particularly to people who had been in academia for many years. At that stage, we took in larger student numbers. There was an emphasis on a more diverse student population. And I think importantly, a focus around moving from teaching to learning, which I think was one of the most positive aspects of the whole move towards Bologna, that we stopped thinking of teaching content and we began to follow student learning. The final one of a universal system, we move more to financial management and the power of big university data to control what we do and to measure what we do, sometimes not in the most useful way. But an issue certainly I see in many countries, and we see across U21, is the fact that it can put teaching and research in conflict, of how we value teaching, how we value those in our universities that are good teachers, how we make sure that as people move towards promotion, that they're adequate, that their work is adequately measured against the much more easily measured research. And I have sat on promotion boards where it is so easy to measure somebody's research output and so difficult to measure somebody's teaching quality. And again, in the universal system, you're looking at an emphasis on ranking performance, and increasing national students, and finally by our students who communicate so heavily in social media. We'll talk about that a little more when I begin to talk about educational technology. Looking at international strategies, this was a 2013 forecast of how many international students were expected in different countries. And at that time, Germany, the forecast for Germany was that 350,000 inbound international mobile students would be in place by 2020. Do you know what your numbers are now? You overtook that 2 years ago. You now have 374,000 international students enrolled in German higher education. 70% of those are in your universities, not in your polytechnics. So you have now overtaken the forecast, you have a very large cohort of students, and you are a very attractive country for international students. They represent 13% of your student population, and it has grown in the past 10 years by 53%. This is a major growth in your international student population. If you're not already seeing those students in your classrooms, if you're not already seeing them in your laboratories, they are coming your way, and this growth shows no sense of slowing down. In fact, it shows like it's going to continue to accelerate. 1/3 of your international students are studying engineering here. I think the definition of that may include computer science or the broader science, education, technology and mathematics, but certainly the students are coming into the engineering areas. You're the most attractive area for students in the EU. That's for students who wish to move within the EU and for students outside the EU. But your attractiveness is not just about tuition fee. This is also for students coming in to do postdoctoral work where they're paying fees as well. So even when you take into account what students may pay, your country is still a very attractive destination for international students. Your students come from a number of different areas. Interestingly, as an Irish person, you have 2.6% of your students coming from North America. In Ireland, we would have 33% of our international students coming from North America. Just a lot to do with the language, but it also has to do with the huge numbers of Irish diaspora in the US. Your numbers are growing. You have your biggest international cohort is from China. The next is from India. But look at the growth numbers. Your Chinese numbers grew by 6%, but your Indian students have grown by 16% in a year in 2016-17. And again, the connection between India and engineering also affects there. And again, as I say, this is not an issue necessarily for your polytechnics, it is an issue for your universities. There are phases of reaction to international students in universities and in classrooms. And actually these reactions also fit to most non-traditional students, students with disability, students with special needs. And the first is, well, I'm teaching, it's up to these students to learn. I teach chemistry, oxygen is the same in every country, and basically I'm going to keep teaching the way I teach, and the other one is, and I didn't agree that this student could be in my class. Then there's the kind of deficit model. Well, they can't do this, they can't speak the language good enough, they aren't motivated in terms of Chinese students, they don't take notes, and I don't like this. So you fix them and I'll teach them. I often think that the difference between international offices and academics is a little like the difference between sales and production. Sales go out and say, no, we've sold 10,000 of those, and we academics go, we can't teach that, go back and we're not going to fulfill that order. And it's a tension that really exists, and I see it all over the world. All international offices are the same. The next is expecting students to adapt. And a kind of, well, they want an education, it's up to them to change. It's up to them to understand us. As I say, this exists with students with disability. Well, I'll take a blind student into my class, but it's really up to the blind student to work out how he or she is going to deal with the way that I teach. We get to the right point, which is, these are my students, they're different, and what do they need from me to succeed? And what can I do to help them succeed? And one of the areas I see this in most development is particularly how well we supervise international PhD students, and really understanding the different expectations and the different educational backgrounds they come from. In 2014, I spent some time in Beijing training, working with Chinese academics to train Irish academics before they went to China. And I was telling your colleagues last night that I learnt the huge power of post-its. That when you go in and you ask either Chinese students or Chinese academics for views, and particularly I was asking the academics to criticise my Irish colleagues, and they're far too polite to do that. And the only way I could get it to work was to stick something like a piece of paper up on the board and give post-its and say, this is my question, could you write the answer for me? And then I would take the answers back and read the answers. And in some way we were able to pretend that the people in the room hadn't written the answers. And it works really well with Chinese students. If you have a lot of Chinese students, and I reviewed the University of Glasgow in the last 2 years, they have a master's in business studies with 93% Chinese students. Now, it really is questionable when you start to have numbers like that. But if you have growing numbers of Chinese students, I really recommend post-its. Only don't make the mistake I did. Always have all the post-its the same colour. I once brought different coloured ones, and I think they thought I was trying to trick them. But one of the things that the Chinese academics talked about was what Western teachers should expect and not expect from Chinese students. And also this fits for Chinese PhD students as well. They don't ask questions because of fear of humiliation. And the fear of loss of face is very, very strong. So students will not, and we expect our students to ask questions. We know that they're going to do this. It is very, very difficult for Chinese students to do this. And they're much more likely to come to you after class and ask you questions. And what the academics were saying to me, you have to build that in to how you're communicating with them. They do lack, they're shy and they lack confidence to share their opinions. This is a really big issue when you get to a stage with a Chinese PhD student where you want them to, you know, the stage of a PhD, you have to start critiquing the big thinkers in your area. They find that almost impossible to do. And Korean students as well, because teachers are held in such high esteem. So this is a very, very difficult time for Chinese students. But particularly waiting for answers or feedback is hard. They won't challenge your ideas, and they really need to be motivated and encouraged to do that. And I thought this was a direct quote. If students don't answer questions or take notes, don't take it personally, it's not about you. And I have seen academics saying, what, these students are in my class, they're not taking any notes. They're probably taking photographs on their phones of your slides, but they learn differently. The other thing is the understanding Confucian education and Confucian reticence, that these are students who also can pick up mathematical concepts in about 50% of the time that Western students can. So there is something very exciting about Confucian education, but it can feel very odd in our classrooms, and it's really understanding where these students are coming from and where their strengths are and what strengths they can add to our classrooms as well. And really what the academics were saying to me in China just matches good practice in higher education. Understand students' learning styles. They talked about, assess them, give them different ways of assessment. They won't always respond to the same kinds of assessment. Give them background learning tests, check what they know, use a variety of teaching media, use verbal material in more than one way. And the academics spoke to me a lot, and I'm very aware that I'm speaking to you in English at the moment, about language fatigue, about students becoming literally exhausted by the end of the day in speaking in another language, and how you build that into how they're taught. And particularly, and I mean, this is what we're talking about in knowledge transfer, diverse, out-of-class learning opportunities. So all I was hearing in Beijing were basically good teaching practices as well. Moving on to educational technology and reminding you of the headlines we saw in 2012. Will MOOCs kill university degrees? Is this the beginning of the end for higher education? Will everything be? I think one forecaster said that by 2025, half of the world's universities would be closed down. We would no longer need the buildings because all the students would be learning online. And it was a spectacular failure. And all that was promised in terms of MOOCs, very little of it has come about. It was a grand experiment. It was important, but it perhaps is something we should remember when the next shiny and exciting idea in higher education comes our way. These are the figures for the decline in MOOCs. About 10% of students completed MOOCs. And again, it being in an international organisation, I was in College Dublin at that time, but attending Universitas 21 meetings, I would say every single president in that network hoped that MOOCs were going to save their budgets because they were going to be cheaper, they were going to allow more students to come, they were going to cut their heating and lighting bills because the students weren't going to be on campus. What people realised, and the University of Edinburgh has actually still a very successful online teaching centre, is that there are some cohorts that it really suits. In my own college, we have a School of Veterinary Science, and they discovered a MOOC to train veterinarians in the field, and literally they are in the field, they're out in country areas, they're a long way away, that giving them post-qualifying training online was extremely successful, and it allowed more professionals to train that way, but they were paying for it. And that what has worked is that smaller online courses, mostly that students pay for, and that hold credit. And that was the other thing we certainly saw across U21, is students were not motivated on the whole to learn alone if they couldn't get credit for it. But the difficulty was what their home university did with that credit. And many universities were not prepared to accept credits towards somebody's degree that had come from online learning. Again, it was going to be the saviour of the poorer areas in the world. It was going to educate Africa, and it was going to educate India, and it didn't. The biggest people who took up MOOCs were the wealthy countries. And again, it peaked about 2015 and then declined off. And this kind of enrolment is mostly into online aspects of courses that are embedded in university courses or that hold credit. But if you look at the red line, which is the poorer countries, almost no take-up from it. And that was what was promised. What some universities have ended up with are very, very large centres for educational technology. Some of them have been adapted well into the universities area, but for some it was a huge investment. The myths and truths about educational technology. It's not a cheaper option. Done well, it's just as expensive. The cost of a good MOOC is the minimum is €50,000, and that's probably if you don't count your staff time. But making good videos, putting them online, supporting them online. What academics found in supporting MOOCs is they were also awake for a lot of the hours of the day, because students wanted fast responses if they were doing a MOOC at very antisocial hours. But do it well, it's just as expensive. It does allow students flexibility in their learning, but it must be part of a well-designed educational package. And when that happens, it's really powerful. When you can embed aspects of technology, and I'm sure you're doing flipped classrooms where you allow students online activities and then bring them into lectures, but used well and intelligently, it can be very helpful. Students don't like working alone and find it extremely difficult. They find it lonely, they find it's hard to motivate. Have you ever started a MOOC and not finished it? I have. I start off the first module and I'm going great, and then I really, really mean to do the next module the next day, and then I maybe, and you don't do it. There isn't somebody there. It's very hard. And if we as academics can't do it, how are we expecting our students to do it? And students want a university experience. They want to come to our universities to meet other people, to learn with other people, to socialise, to have their opinions challenged, to have their views changed. And there is no online substitution for that. So my caveat, my warning for you is that this was something that was sold to universities as the great hope of seeing us into the 21st century. We've learned a lot from it, but I just give it as a warning of something that appears to be too good to be true. And if it is too good to be true, it probably is. It isn't going to work. And the last is, this is a study from the University of Amsterdam, and it's a fairly new study, and it's been looking at students from beginning of school, from 5 years into university, and they now say that books are better for learning than screens. Think of the next time you're on a flight. If you were on a flight 5 years ago, how many of your fellow passengers were carrying Kindles? And how many are carrying books now? People like books. They like the feel of them. They like turning the pages. The sales in Kindles have dropped, have plummeted. They're not selling anymore. People have returned to the printed word. But what they are discovering, and particularly in Ireland, there was a great push at one stage. We're going to have an iPad for every child from age 5 to 10 in the classroom. They're coming back out of the classrooms again, and they're going back to more traditional ways just because students learn better and they understand more from learning from a page. They will tell you they like the screens, but again, the figures from this, and I would give it to you, it's an initial study, they will work more on it, but they finding, again, the learning, particularly at the younger ages, are better from the printed word. But it is part of using educational technology intelligently as a blended way of teaching. And my fourth area is the fourth industrial revolution. We have the University of Johannesburg in our network, and they're doing some of the best work I've seen on the fourth industrial revolution. Not just on the technology, but on the human aspects of it. The first industrial revolution, and look at it, the thing that scares me about this is the speed of change. We're talking about the late 1700s. This was the railway, steam engines, moving into the 1800s, where we have electricity and the growth of industry, to the 1980s and the digital revolution and the move from analog to digital, and the emergence of our personal communication devices. But now we're looking at artificial intelligence, and particularly about robotics. You know, you go on a website and a little window pops up and says, "Can I help you?" You have a chat to that. You're talking to a robot. We already interact significantly with robots. But how is this going to impact the students that we train in our classrooms at the moment? 5 million jobs will be lost between 2015 and 2020. And 35% of core skills will change. These are World Bank figures. So we have to think about what areas will go and what areas will grow. The areas of loss we already kind of know about: routine, repetitive, predictable jobs, the secure jobs, the job in the bank, the job in the insurance company, even some legal jobs. And big data analysis. Now, I know our School for Computer Science at the moment is thriving on big data analysis, but the change that will come into this in the next 4 or 5 years. The areas that will grow are about when you need a human and the importance of human and human intelligence. Levels of human interaction, even in the guiding of robots, or in the intersection between humans and robots. Complex interaction with people. We're not predictable. Yes, you can speak to your robot online for a while, but throw it a few really odd questions. You'll end up with a human being. It will deplete the robot's capacity to answer you. You will eventually get to speak to, in fact, you want to speak to a human being, ask the difficult question immediately. Jobs that are unpredictable. Emergency responses, something that has to be thought about very quickly. Your washing machine repairer will always be needed. The person who needs to come to your house will always be needed, but also big emergencies dealing with medical and technological emergencies. And the good news is education and training will always be there. And it will have, and that's why I'm kind of so excited about MOOCs not having worked as well as we thought, because it goes back to the human importance of the teacher. And the importance of the teacher, that if you want to train students, because when you're talking about knowledge transfer, this is all about this unpredictability, this ability to think in different ways, the ability, and particularly to think about, we're going to have to train and retrain our students a number of times. Nearly all our graduates that leave us will not stay in the job, the first job, or even the first discipline that they will go into. And it's highly likely that in 20 and 30 and 40 years' time, they will have changed professions or disciplines because of the changing demand. And we have to train them to have that flexibility, to take what we've taught them at different stages of their lives and take that knowledge and reinvent themselves with it. Looking at the World Economic Forum importance of skills, if you compare the skills they're looking at between 2015 and 2020, the difference between creativity, that creativity seen as the least important of the skills, to the third most important. We have to teach students to think creatively. The importance of critical thinking, and the importance of words that I've been using for 25 years as an academic: emotional intelligence and cognitive flexibility, of how we train students to literally be able to have a 360 capacity to turn their mind around. One of the classes that I still teach in Dublin is one with our absolutely elite academics, our elite students. These are the ones that come in at the 95th to 100th percentile in gain. They ace every high school examination, and they come into law, and they come into medicine, and they come into actuarial science, and they are really, really used to success. And they hate group work, because group work messes with that. And I teach a course called Surviving Group Work. And I always say, you don't have to attend it if you can assure me that you're going to work alone for the rest of your life. But it's teaching these highly, highly intelligent students love simple answers, because that's how they succeed. And teaching those students creativity, throwing them out of their comfort zone, throwing them into what I'd say is sort of safe insecurity, will really help them learn. And I was talking last night to Arthur and to Ruth about the importance of, for us as teachers, in modelling failure. That we have to teach our students to learn from failure. It's one of, in terms of the theories around critical thinking and reflection, we're far more likely to adapt the way we work if we've gone through failure. If things go fairly well for us, we will just keep working the same way. Actually, even when we're not getting great results, we tend to work in a pattern. But if you want somebody to significantly change the way they act and the way they perform, you have to get them to look at failure, and you have to get them to think of, what assumptions did you make before that failure came? When I started doing this, I found it almost impossible for the students to give me examples of failure. And I used to, first of all, I realized I had to give them an example of somewhere I had failed. I worked mostly with health science professionals, so it was an example of working badly with the patient. And then I had to actually say to them, I will not grade your exercise if you come back and tell me you had a success. I don't want to see a success. I accept you had a lot of successes, but I need to see something that went wrong. And then you have to take those exercises and you have to analyze them with the students. So it's not enough for them to think about it. You have to work with them to help them see where their assumptions were incorrect and how they would do things differently. And that kind of modelling of failure is extremely important in students. It terrifies really good students. Because if you think, what do we only reward success. That's what we do in universities. We say, get it right, we'll give you a good grade. So giving a good grade for failure is feels very uncomfortable. And but try it, but you will have to model it first. You will have to stand up there, and it's not as easy as it sounds either. How will the fourth industrial revolution impact what we teach? We have to teach knowledge transfer. You're, as we say in English, absolutely on the money in what you're looking at. It's how we teach for students to take skills and to take ideas and to take concepts and to be able to implement them and expand them into different areas. And Arthur's very pleased about this. We have to extend capabilities for liberal arts education, and the importance of creativity and the importance of broad education for students, and of giving students the chance to have creative ways of learning and creative ways of getting to their knowledge transfer becomes important. And certainly they feel that the liberal arts framework will become far more important. Being able to blend technology, to understand how technology impacts people. And even if we're training scientists and we're training computer scientists and we're training engineers, they must understand behavioralism. I come from a behavioralist background. They must understand how people interact with technology, that it's not just what they design, but how this is going to interact with the end user. That our curricula emphasize interconnections. We're going to have to see more of blended curricula, green engineering, to look at behavioralism and computer science, where we're going to have to see how different parts of disciplines come together. It will also impact on how we teach. We need those new blends of delivery, intelligently using educational technology, flipped classrooms, and particularly ways in which we get students to apply knowledge, and in the application of that knowledge, understanding that it's applicable in a number of different situations. Self-directed learning with emphasis on creativity, building critical thinking and cognitive flexibility into students, and teaching for adaptability, flexibility and change. And also teaching in teams, going back what I'm saying, surviving group work, working with our students in teams and getting them to understand that if they work together, they will get a better answer, but learning that for our brighter students remains very challenging. And also resequencing when our students come in and out of universities. We're more likely to see students coming in maybe initially for 2 or 3 years, going out into industry or into business or into performance, but coming back in 2 or 3 years' time and retraining. And we may see that the cycle that we're very used to now adapting. I'm going to end with a few quick examples of how these approaches are being applied across U21. I'm going to talk about curriculum mapping. This is a really dull, boring part of what we do. And I know it's what most academics hate. You know, we're going to do a new course, we have to do the learning outcomes, but it is actually, if we can understand where the learning is occurring in a curriculum, you will teach it better, and you also can cut down on what you do. And you can also see what's missing. Often when you look at the beginning of a course and you ask individuals to, map their course learning outcomes here, your course learning outcomes here with your program learning outcomes. This is a really nice one where all the courses are matching the program learning outcomes. You'll start with thinking, well, everybody in every course is measuring the same learning outcomes. And then having to say to a teacher, actually, this is a learning outcome that's been measured in 4 other courses in this program. Can you stop measuring it? And academics will say, oh no, it's very important that I continue to measure it. I don't mind what all those other people are doing, but I want to make sure. But actually having an idea across a curriculum that you don't need to keep testing students on the acquisition of a learning outcome. You have to make sure it's broadly spread about. The University of UNSW in Sydney in Australia, particularly good at mapping their courses. I know you already do this, but I'm coming back to its importance in the design, in really getting right how you teach and what you teach, is making sure that you have the right balance in your curriculum mapping. So if you're making sure that your program outcomes are broad, but they're the kind of program, or course outlines and program outcomes that students can use and adapt and use in different situations. The second is, I think, the most important thing in higher education, starting and ending with authentic assessment. And I love the work of John Biggs in constructive alignment. And he said, you know, you don't end with assessment. You start at the very beginning and say, how are we going to measure? How are we going to know at the end of this program what these students will be able to do? So you start with that end product and how you're going to measure it, and then you work backwards to what you're going to teach. You don't start with content. And if you start with good assessment, it will drive learning. Good assessment drives learning. And students, you go back to, you know, the hidden curriculum. John Dewey, my hero. John Dewey talked about the hidden curriculum in 1914. Benson Snyder in MIT talked about it in 1968. It doesn't matter what you teach your students. Their eye is, how is this going to be assessed? I am going to learn to the exam. I am going to learn to perform in the exam. So you have to make sure that what you're assessing absolutely makes those students, motivates those students to learn what you're going to assess them on. And thinking intelligently about assessment is one of the most powerful ways to change the way you teach. An authentic assessment is really saying, in University College Dublin, we have 30,000 students. We have 77,000 exam sittings twice a year. In a big hall, given that we can't accommodate them in the university. Assessment doesn't need to be necessarily in a closed room asking students to remember things. And the danger is, and particularly with online, that academics rightly become concerned and say, it's the only way I can check that students haven't plagiarized. It's the only way I can check that students haven't got the answers out of the internet. So you have to think about, how do you assess them in a way that's authentically measuring their capabilities, but isn't sitting them in a room, getting them to write things on paper. As authentic assessment can be in the form of a performance or a product, getting them to build something. It must ensure transfer of knowledge. So you're asking them to do something in one domain, but part of the assessment can say, how can this apply somewhere else? It must challenge students. It has to be accurate. This isn't what we'd say in English, tree hugging. This isn't easy. This has to be really where we measure what students can do. It has to have feedback built in. And also it has to have teamwork. And all back to, they must be able to work together, even when they don't like doing that. And these are examples of authentic assessment from the University of Birmingham. Writing a grant proposal, particularly if in your area there is a government demand for a response. So is there something you can get that you can get your students to draft a grant proposal? Get them to design your learning, some learning tool for the first year students in your course. Get your fourth years to design a piece of learning equipment for first years. Get them to write a policy brief for government and submit the best one. This has, I've seen this work really well. Give students an article you're submitting to a journal and get them to tear it apart for you. Or particularly if you've been turned down, show them what was said and get them to say, what would you change now as a result of the response that you've got? They love that. And they love it because, again, it starts to model your failure, but also the fact that they're going to work with you. Organise a poster conference or produce videos or blogs. They take more work. Actually sitting in that darkened room is very cost effective for all of us. But authentic assessment, but it allows you to do less of it. And if you can get that assessment right, it actually will be really powerful. The third area is co-creation with students. And I think Ruth was saying, Arthur was saying that he'd been at the University of Santa Barbara, where students are customers. But this is not about students as customers. This is students as learning partners. So thinking about student choice in content, in pedagogy, asking them what they like, asking them how they want to be assessed. There's a whole field, I haven't time to go into, but about learning analytics. MIT use this, where they measure what form of assessment suits students best, and they measure them according to that. If they want to write an essay, they can do that. If they want to write a poster, they can do that. The answer is actually the better the assessment, the better they learn to produce the assessment. So why force them into a form of assessment just because it's the one way to do it? Peer teaching. Get your students to teach each other. Get older students to teach younger students. There is no better way for students to get to know something than to teach it. And also co-creation as the course unfolds. After week 3, go in and say to the students, okay, what are we going to do differently? What worked in the past 3 weeks? What are we going to do differently? And this isn't about simplifying. It isn't about saying, well, okay, I'll stop making this hard. If you challenge your students well enough, they will come up with really good ideas. But it's not making it easier. It's just making sure that they're involved and they're engaged and they're invested in their own learning. I'm not going to go through this, but I've given this presentation as a PDF, and I've put a number of references on it. And I would advise you to look at the work of Cathy Boville in the University of Edinburgh, and she's done a lot of work on co-creation with students. And finally, students as researchers. And this is about a piece of research that I did in Universität College Dublin, where we were talking a lot about research-informed teaching. And we were all saying that we did research-informed teaching. And I funded 8 academics for 2 years, 4 of them to go and research what the academics thought it was, and 4 of them to go and look at what the students thought it was. The academics thought it was 3 different things. They thought it was research-enriched teaching. That was when we go into our classrooms and we talk about our research with students. The second was teaching of research skills. Well, we teach them research skills. We teach them qualitative research. We teach them quantitative research. They have those modules through their program. And the third was students actually as co-researchers. Students didn't see it, and they thought that all worked really seamlessly. Students didn't see it that way at all. They didn't see research as really coming into their lives until the final part of their program, and they felt it occurred quite randomly. We then took the 3 areas that the staff had talked about, and we said, well, talk about research. Do staff come in and talk to you about their research? And they said, yeah, it's kind of randomly across the 4 years of my undergraduate degree, staff come in and tell us about their research. And we said, does it work for you? And they said, sometimes. And we said, why? What is it? And they said, it's when what they're talking about, I've a hook in my brain to hang it on, because it matches something I'm learning. And they, and actually the example of the staff that brought in his journal article was one of those, because the journal article was on something that the students were learning. We had one physiology class where they were learning the physiology of the lungs, and the teacher brought in a mountaineer who talked about breathing at high altitude. And the students said suddenly, all the lights went on for them. So what they were saying is, yes, it works, but just randomly talking about your research maybe isn't that interesting, but it's when your research matches my learning. The second was teaching research skills, which kind of as academics we're fond of, and that's plotted through the curriculum. The students hate this. They think it comes at the wrong time, they think it comes randomly, and it's mostly not applied to anything very useful. So the timing of it is wrong. And we all say we have to teach them research skills, but unless we're giving them something that they can immediately apply those research skills, we're not giving them those tools at the right time. What they love is being researchers. They find it the most transformative part of their learning. They see it in a small way as they come up through the early years, but they see it very much as occurring in their the kind of keystone project at the end of their program, and the importance of that project. And when we talked to them about it, they talked about, it's the first time I felt like an engineer, a scientist, a social scientist, a nurse. It's the first time I felt real. It's the first time I felt like a university student. It felt like I had the skills. And the importance of this for the transfer of knowledge, that you give them something and you help them apply it, and you also challenge them to see how this works outside. It is, of course, the most expensive. Coming in and talking about your students with the brain hooks is free. This is low cost, this is very high cost. And I saw when we hit really hard financial times in Ireland, these were the projects that became at risk because they were expensive. But in terms of transformative learning and teaching transferable skills to your students, you cannot do without it. And I think good assessment and application will really are the twin skills that I have seen replicated across the world. So my final thoughts, we're in a period of very rapid social change. Universities hate change. We are very, very traditional and we take it slowly. So it's not easy for us. Respect for teaching is declining, but I remind you that we are always going to be the key part of the human dimension to student learning. Design-led teaching, effective curricula, putting your assessment and focusing on assessment is key to success, and working in partnership with students, even when they challenge you, even when they say, well, actually what would really suit me is if you stopped teaching me altogether and we had no assessment, and challenging them back to help you design their learning with them. And I'm finishing with John Dewey because I love John Dewey. Education is a social process. Education is growth. Education is not preparation for life. It is life itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Barbara. You got the biggest applause of all the keynotes here. I could say that because the other keynote speakers went away. So I can say it now. It was the biggest and longest applause. Thank you very much for your interest in fact and figures, also for our intercultural non-sensibilities, perhaps sometimes, in classroom, and for this reticence to accept other methods of learning and so on. Now it's time for questions for you for a discussion. Und ich sehe viele, zwei sofort, Mengen zeigen auf, in German and in English possible.
Barbara, thank you very much for this fantastic talk, and it was heartwarming for me. You have one fan more now. Just one thing on the last slide that I would like to discuss with you. So you say it's becoming increasingly difficult for us in teaching with this discrepancy for research universities. But if you look into Germany, you've seen that we have more and more programs that support teaching with money. And I would take a completely different point of view. I would say we have the chance we have never had before. Because now we can, there is a shift with the politicians, how they look at the universities. And I think that we just have to, well, grab the opportunities that are lying there to make that shift within our universities. But I would like you have a much broader scope to comment on that.
I think Germany has been very, very intelligent, not chasing rankings as much as other countries have. I know, but I think you haven't chased them as much. And I think the danger with international rankings is the primacy of research. And what I'm seeing internationally is this big debate with particularly mid-career academics of, do I close my office door and write a research paper, or do I improve my teaching? And that worry that I won't get tenure, I won't be made a professor, and I will only get to a professorial rank on my research. And I always worry about promotion boards, where it's so easy to measure research success and it's so hard to measure the qualitative. I suppose the biggest fight I have ever had on promotion boards is that when somebody comes, a good researcher comes who is a little bit short on research to make the next grade, and being said, and somebody turned to me and say, but isn't he a good teacher? Where's the evidence? I can see these other teachers that have done curriculum development and work with students. So I think the importance is that it is valued, but it's valued right up to the professorial level. And one of the things we're devising in U21, which will be open source, is a framework in which people going for promotion, particularly, I know you don't have associate professor, but associate professor and professor can argue more quantitatively success in teaching. So I think, yes, the money will be there, but you just need to make sure that your really good practitioners get promoted.
This is going to be an odd question, I suppose. Thank you very much first. I feel very much enlightened, but I feel much more scared. I think I'm very open to teaching and everything, but you put so many dimensions of challenges to us that I feel like getting on the train, going back to Hamburg, hide in my study, and just not look at your presentation one more time. So could you say, I think this is a hard challenge, but could you say something that would cheer me up?
Okay. Start with something you really like. Start with the course you really like. You know the courses you hate teaching, and the course you go, oh, that's the course I like today. Start with something you really like and that you know your students respond well to you, and make small qualitative changes to that, and try one thing out at a time. And in most of your universities, you've centres for teaching and learning, you have experts in your area, but change one type of assessment. Move one paper out of the exam hall and into your classroom. Get one aspect of, you don't have to do it all tomorrow, but do it with the course you feel most comfortable with, because that's less change for you, and then go for the one that is going to make most work. But what you don't need to do is throw everything out. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But start with something you really like. And it's when you feel happy with the kind of changes. And also, I think you'll find new things about your students that you didn't know. I think one of the things, as I've grown older and older, I've begun to say, I have really, the greatest thing about in the job we have are our students. I mean, they drive us crazy at times, but there's times they do things that you're just so proud of them, and they're so good, and I think it's kind of keeping that in your mind as well. Don't despair.
Thank you very much. One personal question maybe. You are fast, but universities are slow. Why are you still working for universities?
I love teaching. I absolutely love teaching. I started off as a social worker. I was a social worker for 10 years, and and particularly when I went into senior management, I never used social work skills as much as I did in negotiating change. I negotiated full curriculum change in a very big university and managed not to get killed in the process. But I love teaching, I believe in teaching, and I love students. I think I suppose I've been in senior management for a long time. The move to Universitas 21 has been a really lucky break for me, because it has allowed me really gather up that international dimension, but also to see there's far more similarities across the world than there are differences. And actually, if you can change things, when vice presidents, academics get together, they all quietly say to each other, how are you doing that? You know, what is happening? People can change, but I think it's probably my social work background has helped, and I've increasingly worked in behavioralism and understanding how people work. And I think it's knowing when to push and when not to push. And I also like negotiation skills. Actually, one of the pieces of work I do, I consult for the European police forces and border guards for Frontex on the training of border guards. And that has been the most fascinating job, because that's working across the whole of Europe. We were talking about the difficulty of international partners saying, well, we can't do that in our country. And how you start getting people to understand change.
Yeah, hello, my name is Eric. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really, really fascinating for me, and I learned a lot. And it sparked within me a question. So we all sitting here and we are socialized in a particular way. So we are socialized in, you know, learning from somebody who's standing in front of us, telling us a lot. And even here within this great conference, we do still the same way of teaching us. So how do we, as researchers or in other positions, how do we learn to teach differently? I mean, we sit here the whole day, listening to people standing in front of us. We do a little workshop, but which is also not really driven by any kind of aim. I mean, no. I learned a lot here, and it was a really great conference, but it's still very much done in a way like we have been doing it for over the last, I don't know how many years. And I really want to see, I really want to learn how to do things differently, but I don't know how.
Okay, I think two ways that you need to leave here with a bit like I was saying to your colleague, with one thing that you're going to try. That the next time you start a course, you're going to make one fundamental change to that course, and you're going to see how it works. And for those of you at the higher levels of university, you are going to see how those changes can get recognized and rewarded, and how your staff can be rewarded for taking that kind of change. And then you're going to write about it. And the danger with some of the publications in teaching is they tend to be very small scale. So find out somebody internationally that's trying the same teaching change as you. There's great generosity in the teaching tribe is very generous. The teaching tribe will always give you the notes, will give you the resources. So find somebody who is doing the kind of work in the discipline you are, but try one thing, and then just cold call somebody on the far side of the world and say, I'm trying this in Germany. How are you doing it in Hong Kong? And can we try something together? And I think you'll find the tribe is out there. But also you need to make sure that your university will recognize that kind of innovation, and it's something you can use to further your own career.
Thank you for your speech. It was really enlightening. My question is, especially in Germany, as full professors, our incentive is to publish.
Yes.
So we are only really judged by how much money we bring in and how many high-profile publications we put out. And so I'm curious, how did, I mean, I love that you said research-based teaching is the way to go, and this will impact students. So I love to hear that, but how did you balance that in your own career? Did you have a more teaching trajectory and negotiated, or how did you balance that with research?
First of all, I was lucky to be in a university that you could go for professorship with. you have to have a base level of research output, but you could argue that you can bring one, either research or teaching, at a slightly higher level. And because I had published a lot in the area of critical thinking and reflection, I chose to go for my professorship that way. I think the real problem is where you publish. I talked about those 8 academics that I funded to do the research. One of the essential outcomes that they had to, when we funded them, was they all had to get one joint paper and one individual paper out of that research. So that we had a reason to be looking at teaching-based research, but that there also had to be an outcome. And I think, again, in fairness, if at senior management you're bringing up your good teachers, you have to make sure that they're publishing. You have to make sure they're publishing in the right places, and to assist them in that. And it is all about making sure you're going on a valued trajectory in your university. But for me, I wrote books rather than journal articles. And I was very lucky that one of them got taken up by nurses.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk and the great overview contained therein. My question emerged when you showed the slide on elite system, massified system, and universal system, and I kind of asked myself to what extent that typology was actually empirically grounded, or if you arrived at it through, let's say, conceptual reasoning. And I would like to translate it into a broader question, because you spoke about broad tendencies, and I wanted to learn a bit about national differences, either persisting ones or potentially emerging ones. And as a related point, how about individual profiles of universities? Because I could imagine that all these transformations you're talking about pose, let's say, similar challenges, but the reactions to them could be quite diverse, varying across or between countries and also within countries. So that's why I'd be interested in national differences on the one hand and individual profiles of universities on the other hand.
I can give you the basis of those figures. A lot of them are through the World Bank or the World Economic Forum for the massification. Looking at, say, across our own network, if we look at the National University of Singapore, Singapore has made a national decision to emphasize science. They have strategically increased the number of students in science and in what we'd call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and have diminished liberal arts. So one of the fact that they're also fighting their position in the rankings, thank you, in their position in the rankings, and for the first time they have dropped down as the first university in Asia, and they've been overtaken by a Chinese university. I think particularly the oncoming power of the Chinese universities is a major factor across nations and individual universities where they're watching their rankings. I think the influence of rankings, you cannot underestimate it in how funding is developed, but also the emphasis on national systems. You're the political scientist, yeah. But the influence of the government. And certainly what our US colleagues are saying at the moment is that the current US administration is having a devastating impact on American higher education, not only because of lack of funding, but also because of the demonization of knowledge and of informed knowledge coming out of universities. And what they're seeing is that the general tenor of conversation is that academics are not to be trusted, that they're elite, that they're overpaid. And one of the things that our colleagues were saying recently is that if you look at even very high-level debate on American television, you will very rarely see an academic, because they are not seen as a trusted person. And what you're more likely to see is somebody who has not gone to university but done well in business or done well. And it's that kind of changing value. So no system remains impermeable. But the impact of your national system, whether it's a conservative or a liberal system, your governmental system, and also where your opposition is. And I think that internationally, what all universities are looking at is the emergence of the Chinese higher education over the next 20 years, and the amount of investment in China into some very fine universities. And that really has the impact. It's kind of multifactorial. I don't think I've answered your question well, but I'll talk to you later. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the highly inspiring talk. Actually, I have two very different questions. The first one goes to your concept of intercultural learning, because I was kind of, irritated that you had kind of a stereotype of the Chinese students who need this and that.
Yes.
And then you talked about intercultural learning, which is something, from my point of view, a bit different than working with stereotypes. So I'd like just to hear a bit more about that. Yeah. And the other question is, I think what is, at the end of the conference, everyone is wondering how to enhance change in the German university system. And you mentioned that universities hate change. It was something that you mentioned. And regarding the questions of my colleagues, you just said, try it on an individual level, try to get in contact with other colleagues. But shouldn't we try to work on different levels, like the governmental or the kind of other leader systems, whatever? So how is it possible really to change university systems from your point of view?
I'm going to answer your second question first. When I was doing a very major change management in my own university, I got a great piece of research. And somebody said to me, there's three groups. There's the early adopters of change. There's people who like change and are going to work easily with you. There's the middle ground that may change or may not. And then there's Professor Grumpy. And Professor Grumpy is never, ever going to change. And they said, don't put your energy into the early adopters. They're going to do it anyway. Don't put your energy into Professor Grumpy, because you're just going to annoy him further and you're going to tire yourself out. Work with the middle ground. And you have to come to a kind of a tipping point that you can get the middle ground towards the early adopters. And that's really, if you're looking for change, it's to identify your middle ground and where you need to get that impetus and that tipping point. You will always have people who will absolutely hate the change, but it's to see how you can start to push the bulk of people towards change. But it is also recognizing the power of the early adopters, the power of your tribe, the power of the people who will work with you, and then trying to get the next person to you that's less sure and getting them on your side. And there's nothing like modelling change. And I'm sorry, remind me of your first question again.
About the stereotypes?
Yes, about college. And I absolutely take it, and it wasn't intended, but you're quite right. I suppose I was using it as an example of where their teachers were talking to us. We have two universities in our network, the University of Hong Kong and the University of California, Davis. And both of them have a really ambitious goal that 100% of their students will have an international global experience. And they're big universities. And they're hitting the difficulty of they can get larger numbers of their students to move. And certainly, opportunities for mobility do enhance critical thought. I mean, actually, the research shows students travelling increases critical thought. They don't actually have to be studying. But if you combine good studying with going somewhere else, your capacity to think critically, because again, you put students in an uncomfortable place. You take them out of their comfort zone. And if you can make sure that you support them enough to go through that change. I was with a group of PhD students earlier in the week, and they were talking about the difficulty of coming to the UK to learn as PhD students, and they were talking about the huge difficulty with the visa system and finding accommodation, learning the language, not having, one of them had their supervisor move to another university, and there was a young woman from Azerbaijan, and she said, you know, it was really, really hard, but I came out of the darkness into the light and I realised how much I had learned. And that kind of burnished by the flame, that learning. So we've huge amounts to learn from our international students. The danger is that we say, well, we have an international campus, so automatically we will all learn cross-culturally. And the fact that actually international students at the end of the day, if they've been speaking in a language that's not their first language, there is security in going back to finding people from your own country. The Irish are great for finding Irish ghettos. You know, I passed an Irish pub in Konstanz. I thought, oh, that's why the Irish are. But there is something about finding your own country tribe. But it's how you bring in interculturality into your classrooms, and it is really important. It's a very interesting piece of work by the University of Warwick, and I'll find the reference for you. But the woman who has done it is a linguist, but she's done some really interesting research on how campuses change to encompass, to become multicultural. And she actually based it primarily on the way people talk to each other, and the use of language and the use of multiple languages, and just how we speak to each other. And then she has gone through how we incorporate different nationalities in our classrooms and how we use from them. So I'll give you that reference. Her surname eludes me at the moment.
Thanks a lot for the very inspiring talk, and I'm very happy that it was videotaped, because I will watch it again, and I already know a couple of people I will recommend it to. So thanks a lot for that. And well, we have been talking a lot about transfer of teaching the recent 2 days, and transfer in a sense that you design teaching formats in collaboration with institutions outside of the university. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you told us was connects very well to that. And what I was wondering now is, we all believe this makes sense and it's a treasure, and also connects to research-based teaching and learning. But is it only us who think this way, or what you think about, or what can you tell us from your little broader view with your international experience of the global landscape of teaching and learning on higher education? Is it like a trend? Is it like the MOOCs? Is it something that arises, or is it just us who think it makes sense?
No, I think transfer of knowledge is actually an evolution of a focus on quality student learning that has been there from reflection, critical thought, cognitive flexibility, because it's about teaching students to be adaptable and to use knowledge intelligently and well. So I can see it as a clear evolution. Yeah, I think the countries that I see really excellent teaching going on is particularly Australia. I think they have valued teaching very strongly in Australia. I think they're now under a very conservative administration, so there's a bigger push for them to go more on a research dimension, but there's still some very fine work done there. I'd recommend you look at the work of the Centre for the Study of Higher Education in the University of Melbourne, as they've done some of the biggest studies. A lady called Kerry Lee Krause in Australia, who I can't remember, I know she's moved universities, but has done really, really good work. She and a gentleman called Richard James in Melbourne did some big study, particularly on first year engagement, some of the big data studies in Australia, and I think they're always worth looking at. I think, again, the UK is very good. I think they're in difficulty at the moment because of their kind of political situation. But where I'm seeing, again, I usually start with Australia. But I think sometimes student mobility and internationalization has been somewhat of a distraction from student learning because it's been the practicalities of mobility. But I think what you're talking about intercultural change is actually a far deeper and a more meaningful part of that. That's why I'd send you to Warwick to look at that.
Thank you a lot, Barbara, for your answers now and for your arguments. And I learned one outcome for me is to change university. You need somebody with a background of a social worker, I think, that could help to convince also the grumpy professor, perhaps. Thank you a lot. Now we have a coffee break, and perhaps there is an opportunity for some others, like the Chinese student, perhaps to go now and to ask a question. Thank you a lot.